All right, my fellow Lance and Star Commanders. Today I want to talk about Battletech Alpha Strike Tactics or Tactica. I want to start this series and look at a couple of different tactical items and considerations. And the point of this is not to get down into the nitty gritty and tell you exactly how you have to run a specific mission or a specific list and how you're tactically going to achieve your objectives. Instead of what I want this kind of series of videos and discussions to be focused around is the 5,000 foot view of these kind of broader tactical topics. There's going to be a lot of stuff that we talk about, and they're going to be more generalities, more general kind of discussions as opposed to specifics. Because when it comes to any sort of war game, Alpha Strike is no different. You know, you have to take things like your objectives, your list, your opponent's list, and the terrain into consideration. What I really want this video to focus on today on deployment is what are the things you need to be thinking of and considering when making deployment decisions and why they're important, right? And the reason is that there can be a lot of pre-game gamemanship that goes into deployment where you can subtly or not so subtly manipulate your opponent and set yourself up for success, or unintentionally hurt yourself and diminish your ability to be successful. You can often win or lose a game, or set yourself up for success or failure would be a better way of putting it, because of how you deploy and because of how your opponent deploys based off of what the mission criteria are and the terrain. Remember, when you're war gaming, this is not chess, right? Where all your pieces are preset in a certain order that more or less mirrors your opponent with a finite number of possible moves that can be done over the course of a game. One of the things that makes wargaming very distinctly different from a game like chess is that there is an infinite number of ways in which you can place your pieces on the board and an infinite number of ways in which you can move and engage your opponent. And there are a lot of variables and uncontrolled factors in the game. And if you set yourself up for success early on in how you place your forces on the board, it can very much dictate how the flow of battle goes and how the mission itself and the game itself unfolds and plays out, right? And all too often, I see when I'm playing other opponents or when I've been at events and I'm just casually watching games or TOing them, people just drop their units down on the board willy-nilly without any sort of real consideration, right? And I've also seen people just immediately go to mirroring what you do as their opponent, right? And you can use this to your advantage. High level, very competent players will be very intentional about how they place units. And very quickly, when you're in a game and a match against someone, if you're paying attention to how they're deploying in response to you and the decisions they're making, you can figure out with a fair degree of certainty, is this person making good decisions off the gate, right? Are they really considering what their objectives are? Or are they mirroring you? Or are they being careless in how they deploy? And you can use this to your advantage. This will communicate to you whether or not you can manipulate their deployment, whether or not you can take advantage of mistakes they're making, or whether or not you need to be more on guard because your opponent knows what they're doing and they're trying to kind of outplay and outcheck you in the deployment phase. And you want to be in the position where your deployment phase, you are giving it as much attention as you would give attention to in making decisions in real time in the game, right? Do not ignore this phase because it is very, very important part of the game, even though it only lasts a handful of minutes, sometimes less than a minute, right? The one thing that I always try to do is try to deploy in a way that forces my opponent to react to me and not the other way around. If you can get your opponent to react to how you're deploying and you can sense that in the deployment, you play something so they mirror you. You do some sort of out there move and maneuver or deployment, right? And so it causes them to place a piece in response to that might be maybe isn't ideal. You're already setting them up for not an ideal deployment on their own end. And you can really take advantage of this if you have a plan and if you focus during the deployment phase, right? The first thing you need to do in the deployment phase is very much understand what the objectives of the mission are. And to do this, you're going to need to go read the missions, right? Whether you're using WolfNet or another format or homebrew, you really need to know the missions, understand them, and understand what the criteria are for winning. After you understand the criteria for winning, right, you need to understand how your force is going to achieve that victory. Whether or not it is strong at the objective or not, you have to have a plan, right? You have to determine which of your units are going to go seize objectives that are closer in, that are further back, which are your units that are going to provide covering fire, that are going to outflank, whatever that might be. You might not have those outflankers. You may not have that covering fire, right? And so you may have to adjust based off of those criteria. Who's going to hold your backfield, right? You already want to be thinking about this when the games is in the deployment phase, because if you just throw stuff down willy-nilly, you're suddenly going to have to spend a lot of effort, energy, mind power, movement, whatever that might be, to then suddenly go and grab those objectives and do those things. Or you may be in a position where you are trying to make a decision between two different units holding a rear objective, and then it gets you flustered and thrown off because you didn't have a plan for those units to begin with. This is super, super, super important to have this kind of game planning, right? So I'm just going to talk about a game I had recently. I was playing my Steiner Scout list, and I had an Atlas in the game. And from the get-go, because I was playing Denomination, I had made a decision. This Atlas, because it only moves 6, is going to sit on a rear objective and cover that. But I also want it to be able to affect the mid-board. So I'm going to cover this rear objective and hold it while also being within range of basically I designed in the terrain a kill box that covers the midboard, so that as my opponent moves into that midboard, I'm going to be able to concentrate fire. And one of the reasons I did this was because I have in that Steiner Scout list not a very fast list, right? I have a couple of hovercraft that do decent, but I've got 2 movement, 12 units, and the rest are all 8s with a 6. So the way I had set up my deployment was to bait my opponent into coming into the center board, setting up the terrain in such a way that I could block line of sight to some of my units and then focus fire on that center board. And then once I had eliminated several of his units, start to move forward, take the center board, take his rear objectives, right? Because I had that slower list. But in order to do that, I needed to have a plan for each of my units, a zone that they could cover, areas where they could hide, things like that. And so during the deployment phase, I have to be very intentional about that. If I want that Atlas to cover that rear objective, or I need him to do that, and he's out of place, it's going to take him how many turns to get there, right? He only moves 6, or a movement 8 unit only goes so far. So the where I put him on the board is going to be relative to what my mission parameters are and what I want for his role to be, right? Now, you can do some shenanigans where you deploy in such a way to pull your opponent off guard, but you have to take into consideration how far a unit's going to move. Something like an Atlas, you're not throwing your opponent off by placing him on one side of the board. Like that Atlas goes on that other side of the board, on the left side of your board, he's not going to be on the right side of the board at any point during the game. But if you have something that's relatively fast, he has more movement flexibility. So maybe you can put him on another side of the board and still, maybe you put him on the center left side of the board and he can still move up the full right side of the board during the game, right? You also need to be super, super aware of what your opponent's units can do and ask questions if you don't. If you don't know that unit that normally moves 12 can actually move 16, you will be at a disadvantage because you're going to make assumptions about that unit during the game. If you don't know that unit can dish 3, like that commando I had, instead of 2 like it normally does, you will be at a disadvantage during the game. If you don't know that the hovercraft goes faster or slower than it normally does, you can be at a disadvantage. So you want to have a general awareness of what your opponent's units can do, and then pay attention to where he's putting them down and know where their threat projection could be. And by threat projection, I mean, where could they physically be when they move, and what is their damage output at what ranges, right? This unit doesn't do a lot of damage at medium, but he could be anywhere in this coordinate of the board, or this quadrant of the board is different than a unit who moves slow but has a large damage projection, right? Those are things you have to consider, and you have to think ahead. I like to think ahead at least 2 turns. usually after 2 turns, you're going to have to do a lot of on-the-fly adjustments within how you're playing, but pretty reliably within the first turn or two, you should have a plan of where you want your units to be at the end of turn 2, and then deploy in such a way that they can actually achieve that and get there, right? You want to do that because what it does is it keeps the initiative and the momentum of the game in your court. And if you can keep that initiative and momentum, and I don't mean the initiative like the initiative roll, I just mean the inertia of how the game is playing. You can, if you stay in control of that momentum, you are the one who's dictating where combat occurs, where engagements occur, how those engagements unfold. You get to decide who's fighting and who's not fighting during a game. And in the deployment phase, you are setting yourself up to be able to do that. So you need to be thinking ahead. Don't deploy your Atlas on the left hand side of the board if you know he's going to be needed on the right hand. And that seems fairly obvious. But when you start getting into units that are, say, movement 8 or 10, it might not be as obvious, right? And you may inadvertently, say, mirror an opponent unintentionally when that movement 10 Austral really needs to be on a different side of the board, right? Or in a different spot. And if you don't have that plan, you're not going to know he needs to be there. And then suddenly at the end of turn 1, you're like, oh crap, I'm totally out of position, right? You don't want to be there, right? So you need to be thinking ahead a turn or 2, maybe even 3 during the deployment phase about how do I want and how do I foresee this mission unfolding, right? The next thing you need to do is consider the terrain. This is going to be different on every single board you play on, whether you're playing WolfNet, where players get together and they set up the boards together before each mission, or whether you're playing in a format where the terrain is predetermined for you, or you're playing a scenario where it's predetermined for you. You want to look at the terrain and you want to really understand where are your line of sight blocking pieces of terrain, where's the how would be the best way to advance up the side of a board or down the center of a board while providing cover for yourself. How are you going to get from point A to point B while maintaining cover or maintaining line of sight blocking? If you're going to set up things like kill boxes or focus fire or limit your opponent's fire, how do you use the terrain to do that? And then once you understand that, you can start to see how you might need to manipulate your opponent so that he can't take advantage of that, right? He or she can't take advantage of that. You know, if your opponent has a piece of terrain that may help you split their force in half, maybe you deploy in such a way and you hope that they mirror you, or you try to get them to mirror you, or you bait them to mirror you so that you can manipulate them to throw part of their force, basically eliminate a portion of their force from a significant round of combat, right? So you can do this during the deployment phase. I'm going to give an example too of terrain from me and my buddy Jairus's Gen Con experience. In the final game, we played some friends of ours for first place, and when we got to the board, the terrain was very sparse, right? Very open, and they had a very, very huge like damage output advantage over us. So we were throwing like 42 shots at medium, 43 shots at medium, and they were throwing 60 shots at medium. There's no way we could go toe to toe with our opponent's force, right? And so we knew this because we understood what their list could do, but we also knew that their list was fairly slow. And the terrain was fairly open. It had a lot of these like desert spires, right? And so what we did is starting with terrain deployment in the middle, we slowly moved that terrain to one side of the board. So they spread their terrain out, and we basically concentrated all our terrain on one half of the board, which allowed us to then when we went to deploy our troops, deploy them on one half of the board and really concentrate our force in one area so that we didn't have to get into this long range, mid range duel where they were just going to wipe us out. And so because we understood how that terrain looked, it helped us dictate where we played the terrain, but it also helped us dictate how we played our units. And then when we played our units, we had some very fast harasser hovercraft that we deployed kind of out in the open a little more. And even though we never moved them across this huge open gap, these harasser hovercraft were like TMM5, they could move across that open hover or open area, and our opponents spread their force out a little more because they couldn't allow these 4 hovercraft to be on one half of the board and be unopposed. And then we simply, in the opening moves, moved them around to our right side from our left, and it pulled our opponent's force. It kind of opened them up and forced them to react to those hovercraft to cover them, but then they had to spend the first couple turns moving back into position to fight the rest of our force. So we were able to successfully, through deployment and terrain, to spread our opponent's much slower force out and then utilize our movement to mitigate the number of units we were engaged with, right? And you can do this on a smaller board. Like the doubles boards are 6 feet wide versus 36 in a singles board in WolfNet format, but you can do this in a singles board as well. Maybe you use your hovercraft and stuff to bait and try to get them to subconsciously or consciously deploy a much heavier, slower unit to react to them, and then move out of the way so that they're out of position, right? And so these are the things that you want to consider when you're looking at the terrain, how it plays out, and what your opponent's list is. Terrain placement dictates a lot about movement, lane of fire, the cover you can do, the approach you can do. Do you have line of sight blocking, like I mentioned? The terrain can also slow your opponent down. And so when you're trying to deploy, and if you're able to sense that you're manipulating your opponent, can you deploy in such a way where the terrain becomes a hindrance for them? Maybe they don't have jump, maybe they have a bunch of slow stuff, and you can get them to have to put terrain between you and them that's going to slow them down and cause them to either have to go around it or over it and delay their ability to get on objectives, right? So these are things that you want to consider as well. Consider your unit's abilities. You really need to do this. Do you have flak? Do you have C3? Do you have ECM? Are you providing enough coverage for those things? Do you have indirect fire? Do you have snipers that need to be in certain positions, right? And try to figure out, like, how can these provide adequate and appropriate coverage, right, for these kind of area effect special abilities, right? Even like snipers and indirect fire, kind of this, they have a bubble that they project, right? Well, is that bubble going to cover your tactics? You do go and you throw your sniper on the right wing, but then you're running up the left, or your opponent's coming up the left, right? Is that a good position for it? And with that said, you kind of want to do this a little bit of um, counter move in deployment, where you're not just throwing down, oh, the next unit that's in my box, the next unit's in my box, but holding off on units that you want to deploy last because you want to know where certain units that your opponent has go first, right? Like, I want to know where my opponent's hovercraft are, so I'm not going to deploy my Atlas yet. Or maybe I want to know where, because of how my game plan is, where my opponent's hovercraft are, because I want to be able to counter them with my hovercraft. Or do I want to deploy my hovercraft in a way that forces them to have to counter me with their hovercraft, right? So these are all things you need to consider when you have that plan, and when you're also considering your abilities and what your tactical flexibility is for those units that you have in your list. Pay attention to what your opponent is doing and try to read their intent. I cannot stress this enough. I know I've talked about it already, but are they being careless? Are they being intentional? Or are they mirroring what you're doing? And then try to take advantage of whatever they're doing. If they're being intentional, try to deploy in such a way that throws them off. If they're being careless, take full advantage of that and try to deploy in a way that takes advantage of their carelessness and their weaknesses. If they're mirroring you, can you get them to deploy something that is disadvantageous for you, or for them, not for you? Also, you need to think about containment, right? And what do I mean by containment? What is your opponent's fast stuff, right? Where does your opponent want to be? And can you deploy in such a way that contains them and prevents them from using those units the way that they want to? And kind of is a check to their move into their deployment, right? How are you going to prevent that hovercraft of theirs from running around the side of you, right? Or how are you going to eliminate, contain, or mitigate the risk that this other heavy mech has, or this assault mech has, that's dishing a large amount of damage, right? So you want to be thinking about containment, and how are you going to, over the course of the next several turns, prevent your opponent from doing what they want to do, and how are you going to nudge and encourage them through your deployment and your opening moves to do what you want them to do. And you can do this in the deployment phase with how you deploy your units. There are kind of three ways that I like to deploy, and a lot of it is, again, dependent on terrain, objectives, my list, and my opponent's list. The first is weighting one side, where you put the bulk of your force to one half of the board. The next is an even distribution, where your units are kind of sprinkled out along your back edge. usually a little more focused in the middle, but not necessarily, but sprinkled along that back edge. And the last is splitting your force, where you have a significant part of your force on one half and another on the other half, but you're more open in the middle. So when you weight one side, the advantage to this is that you're going to be able to focus your movement and fire in an area. But the problem with it is it's going to give up you're going to give up positioning on the board, and you're kind of give away what your in game is and what your goal is. You have everything in one half. Your opponent knows you're going to be driving up that side. And so one thing you can do with this, though, is if you wait to one side and you have fast movers, is you can bait your opponent to try to come over to that one side and then use your fast movers to go up the flank that and reposition and go up the flank that you've abandoned. And this can be really, really good. This particular tactic I find can be really good if your opponent has a relatively slower list. And if you can kind of deploy on the one side in a way that encourages them to spread out, especially if they're spread out, and you can do this. And it's, say, in a mission like, say, Headhunter or Stand Up Fight. When you do that, you can spread them out and then only engage a portion of their force because you're concentrated. And you may even be able to use your hovercraft in your opening moves to encourage them not to concentrate their force, right? And you may only do this with a J. Edgar or something, right? That isn't a lot of points, that doesn't do a lot of damage, but it forces them to have to kind of leave something there to respond to that. But it does give up. You do give up a portion of the board, and you kind of give away everything. Next is even distribution. You're going to cover the whole board. And this can be great if you want to defend along that whole board edge, but what you give up is sometimes you can give up your ability to concentrate, right? And so when you do this, you want to have a dedicated reaction force that's going to help you concentrate in one area or another as your force moves up the board. And you want to make sure that whatever your reaction force is, that it has the speed to be able to do this. So typically what I'm doing is I might put, like, say, a movement 6 unit or 8 unit off center to where I really want to go. So I'm spreading out to get my opponent to spread out, but I might off center my heavy mechs and my assault mechs to, like, the left or right. And then I'll use my speed 10 mechs kind of on the opposite side. So if I'm on the left with my slower mechs, and that's where my real push is going to be, I'm going to put my speed 10 mechs on the right of center line, because they can then kind of obliquely move up with them. And then I'm going to put my fast stuff on the flanks because they have the movement to also concentrate there. But I'm spreading out in the hopes that it'll get my opponent to spread out and then make mistakes when they're placing their forces, right? The other thing you can do is split your force, and you can do this either half and half. You might do 2/3, 1/3, and you're really hyper concentrated on one side, and then you're hyper concentrated in another side, or you have a weighted force on one side and a not so weighted force on the other side. And oftentimes what you're doing here is you're trying to get your opponent to deploy stuff in the extremes, right? And then you're using that to mitigate their concentration of force, but the units you choose to deploy in those extremes need to be able to react appropriately, right? And what I mean by that is, like, let's say I want to go up the right, or I want to go up the right half of the board, but I want to spread my opponent out. So maybe what I do is I put a bunch of speed 12, speed 16 units on my left side, right? 12 to 16 or 12 plus units on my left side. I put my slower stuff on the right side. I start advancing up the board, and then that left side that I've baited my opponent into reacting to can rapidly react and then go up the right and support that main thrust, right? So these are things that you can do with splitting forces. The other thing you can do with splitting forces is go half and half and make your opponent guess at to which side is going to be the main thrust of your attack, and then hyper concentrate your force right before the moment of impact. The other thing you want to consider is any sort of reserve. I oftentimes like to hold back a unit or two. I'll call these like support skirmishers, or you maybe heard me refer to them as linebackers, and have them deployed in such a way that they can exploit any successes or any failures, right? So maybe you have 3 mechs working in tandem with each other. 2 of them are up front, 1 of them is behind, and suddenly the one on the one of the ones up front, maybe the one on the left, is getting overrun. The one that's in behind can then scoot over and support them. or maybe they can then hyper concentrate. He can hyper concentrate on the right if the right mech is having some sort of breakthrough success, right? But you would have to make this decision during the deployment phase. You've got 2 units on the line, you've got one kind of behind who's going to provide support. And you have to make this decision early on, and you have to be intentional about it. Otherwise, you're going to find yourself out of position, and that's the last thing you want to be. You do not want to be out of position because of the way you deployed. And what you want to do with your deployment is try to pull your opponent out of position and make the game more difficult for them to win because you've manipulated or influenced the way in which they deploy, right? So you're putting your stuff down where you want, and they're not putting their stuff down where they want during that deployment phase, right? The other thing you want to consider is if you're going to be using any sort of delaying, blocking, or anchor force or anchor unit. So back to the example of my Steiner Scout list, I chose my Atlas to be a delaying, blocking anchor unit, right? So I had him on my right side, holding down my right objective for domination. And I supported him with a couple of hovercraft. So I had a fairly minimal amount of points. It was around 90 points, I want to say, or maybe 100 points dedicated to that one side. And then my other 150 worked the left side. So I had enough body, enough threat, and enough firepower to hold down my right side from any attack coming from my opponent, while I had a concentration of force on the left side to move up. And the way that this played out in the game was to concentrate the force to the center and to the left, right, with the Atlas in the middle. And then as the game opened, I moved. And because those hovercraft had a fair amount of movement, I moved in such a way that I could move them into that right half of the board while the rest moved up the other side, right? And then I was able to take full advantage. My hovercraft were able to take full advantage of the fact that my opponent had tried to mirror me, and their left side, my right side, was a lot more open. And then the Atlas was able to provide an anchor on the other side with minimal threat coming in, while the main battle happened on the left, right? But the Atlas was also positioned in such a way that he could provide effective support and covering fire, right? And so this has to be done in order to successfully pull something like that off. You have to think about how you're going to do that during the deployment phase, so that you're not caught unaware and you're not reacting on turn one to whatever mistakes you've made, if that makes sense. I hope this video wasn't confusing and you found it helpful. Deployment is very, very important. These are the things I think you need to consider. If there's other things you think you should consider, leave them in the comments below. And otherwise, may the blessings of Blake be upon you.